Okay, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, ambassadors, excellencies, welcome to today's seminar with a highly interesting topic. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Minou. I work here at Folk och Försvar as a program manager for security policy, and I will be your moderator during today's panel. The Global Coalition Against Daesh was formed in September 2014. Sweden has, since August 2015, participated in the military training mission in northern Iraq. With Daesh's destructive way of killing and spreading fear in Iraq and Syria, and with the attempt of spreading the terror to Europe, the coalition is facing a difficult task. But the coalition's members are committed to tackling Daesh on all fronts. During a meeting in July 2016 in Washington, D.C., the Swedish Minister for Defense, Peter Hultqvist, extended an invitation to the coalition to take the next meeting in Stockholm to discuss the coalition's work and the way forward. And due to that meeting, we have the pleasure to have the U.S. co-chair, Elissa Slotkin, with us here today. Elissa is currently the acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs at the US DoD. Needless to say, we at Folk och Försvar are very delighted to have Elissa with us here today. We are looking forward to an interesting presentation, followed by a briefing from our friends at the Swedish MFA and Swedish MOD. And we will end the seminar with a Q&A together with all three speakers. But before I leave the floor to today's keynote speaker, please, during the Q&A, in order to respect her high profile, and also to the sensitiveness of today's topic, make sure to introduce yourselves properly with name and organization that you represent, and also to keep your questions very brief. Elissa, with that said, warmly welcome to Folk och Försvar. The floor is yours.
Thank you to my team for clapping. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for having me and for coming out. I want to thank the institution here that we're standing in. This is a great opportunity for me to get the word out about what we're trying to do with counter-ISIL. And thank you to my Ministry of Defense colleagues who are co-hosting the event with me tomorrow, the Counter-ISIL Military Coalition. It's an extremely important meeting. Hi. See familiar faces in the crowd. So let me make a few remarks and then I'll hand it over to our colleagues here. This month is really the 2-year anniversary of the U.S. engagement on the counter-ISIL campaign. At the core of that campaign is a concept that it cannot be the U.S. alone that defeats Daesh, that we need an international response to meet the international threat that ISIL poses. So we have a coalition of 64 nations, a portion of which are in the military coalition, and 34 of them. And the 34 in the military campaign have contributed military assets to the fight, including personnel, aircraft, significant basing access, et cetera. And then we've had a number provide equipment, stabilization support, humanitarian support. So it's a large effort. But fundamental to our strategy is that it's the coalition enforcing and supporting and enabling local forces on the ground in Iraq and Syria that is going to help us get through and defeat ISIL once and for all. It cannot be us. It cannot be the U.S. and coalition on the ground. We learned hard lessons in the last Iraq war on that. And we've been successful by working by, with, and through local partners. In Iraq, that means the government of Iraq and the Iraqi security forces. That means the Peshmerga, supported by the government of Iraq. A number of Iraq security forces are our partners there, as you all know. And in Syria, that means local forces vetted and trained by us, working on the ground, defeating Daesh. Sweden has been an important contributor to this effort, and as was mentioned, proposed doubling your commitment. We, of course, welcome that. It's a significant contribution, but it is just a piece of the overall effort that Sweden provides, particularly on the issues of humanitarian assistance and stabilization, which is just as critical as the military campaign. The follow-through And the lessons we've learned from the last war on planning for stabilization are absolutely just as important. Otherwise, we're just going to be in an unending cycle fighting this enemy. And so we, as Secretary Carter has said publicly, it is not going to be the military effort alone that actually defeats this organization. So the Swedes are a good example of how we need to work more comprehensively with our State Department, USAID, Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security. It must be a whole of government effort in order to really do what's required on the campaign. Let me tell you a little bit more about how we think we're doing on the campaign. And for those of you who may have heard Secretary Carter talk about this, we think about the campaign in 3 buckets. And we use the analogy to cancer. We have the parent tumor in Iraq and Syria. We have the metastases in places like Libya, in places like Afghanistan. And then we have the bucket of homeland defense, which we all are responsible for through our national authorities. So let me just go through and let you know how we're doing. First on the parent tumor on Iraq and Syria. We have made significant progress, particularly in Iraq, countering ISIL. And we've done this by staying in tune very closely with the needs of the Iraqi security forces as they approach this enemy. The enemy is different than its predecessor, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, for those of you who may remember, who were a capable enemy but who did not fight like a conventional force. ISIL has learned. It has learned from AQI. It has learned from previous engagement in Iraq and Syria, and they have adapted to the point where they use what we'd consider conventional military techniques. So we needed to adapt, and the Iraqis needed to adapt. On the success side, 45% of the territory that ISIL held 2 years ago has been taken back by the Iraqis. In Syria, that 30% of the territory held by ISIL has been taken back. In Iraq, after retaking Ramadi and establishing a base at Makhmour, the Iraqi security forces, with coalition support, went on to retake the towns of Hit, Rutba, Fallujah, Kiara, which is setting the stage for the Mosul operation, which we all know is a critical battle in fighting ISIL, both in Iraq and Syria. In Syria, local forces have taken back towns like Shadadi and are attempting to successfully sever the border between Iraq and Syria, which ISIL had, for all intents and purposes, wiped out. We've taken key links between Raqqa and Mosul, and most recently Manbij City, which was a clear key transit point for ISIL going back and forth across the border and into Turkey and Europe. A key area for plotting and expanding external operations. The approach we're taking in this war is systematic pressure on ISIL. We learned from the last war that it's like a balloon. If you squeeze on one end, they just move somewhere else. So we're using an approach of systematic pressure, putting pressure on their leadership and external plotters, going after their attempts to develop chemical weapons, continuing to attack their economic infrastructure. This has been a particular project for us lately. Oil tankers, bulk cash sites, key financial centers, and we're also taking the fight to them in new domains that we haven't had as much time and experience with, such as cyber. And now we're preparing for the decisive phase of the campaign in Raqqa and Mosul. We recognize, however, that our local partners and their ability to retake Mosul and Raqqa will not be sufficient, that getting the parent tumor is not enough. ISIL is very good at reestablishing itself when it's pushed out of an area. We need to make sure that they have no opportunity to come back to the areas that have been liberated. This is, again, why stabilization is so important. We need to reestablish services, restore communities in Iraq and Syria so that they can sustain for themselves and not be vulnerable to ISIL coming back. We know that just because we hopefully are successful taking Raqqa and Mosul, that it doesn't mean ISIL is done. The discussion now is thinking ahead about what happens if Mosul and Raqqa are taken. Where do the bulk of ISIL's leadership go? And this is where the metastases come in. Do they decide to go to Libya, since that's an undergoverned space? Do they go to Afghanistan and Asia? Other places in North Africa? Do they come home to Europe? These are the fundamental questions that we are working through right now and planning for. On the metastases side of the ledger, as you have noticed, we have taken some strikes in Libya, particularly in the town of Sirte, and together with Libyan forces on the ground have been able to expel ISIL from that city. So I think suddenly ISIL foreign fighters are thinking Libya might not be as appetizing. But it does open the important question on where then do they go. So something we've talked very seriously with your government about and with others is how do we plan together to prevent the return of foreign fighters or prevent them perpetuating attacks once they remain. In a minute, I'll turn it over to questions. Let me just address an issue I'm sure many are interested in, and that is the announcement about a week and a half ago, that the U.S. and Russia have signed a deal or agreed to a deal on Syria. There are multiple complexities about the situation in Syria. It is a significant and heartbreaking foreign policy issue. And while our coalition is focused on ISIL, there is the overlapping complexity of the civil war in Syria, neighbors' concerns about threats emanating out of Syria, and then, of course, Russian and Iranian involvement on top of the coalition's involvement. So there is significant complexity. All I will tell you is that we did agree, as you've, I'm sure, seen in the press, to renewed cessation of hostilities. And that means that we expect the Russians to deliver the Syrians in adhering to that, and we are responsible for delivering the opposition groups that we are in touch with to ensure that calm remains and is kept up for a series of days. The Russians also agreed to humanitarian assistance getting into Aleppo, and that has not yet taken place. So we are urging the Russians to engage the Syrians on that. And then based on those things happening and a few other conditions, we have agreed to set up a joint implementation cell, with the Russians. Again, the specter of the violence and the problems in Syria are so great that anything we felt we could do to help lessen that suffering, we felt was worth trying. But now we have to see whether the Russians and the Syrians that they represent can live up to their end of the bargain. So I'm happy to take what I'm sure will be questions on that, but let me leave it at that and maybe turn it over to my Swedish colleagues.
Thank you, Elisa. Applaud. So we're looking forward to the Q&A, but before that, let me welcome Johan Lagerlöf from the Swedish Ministry of Defense, Deputy Director General and Head of Department for Security Policy and International Relations. Petra Lärke, Director and Deputy Head of Department for European Security Policy, Swedish MFA. Please join me. So after a very interesting presentation and introduction from Elisa, we are very eager to hear about the Swedish contribution to the coalition's work.
Yeah, thank you. Mike, okay?
Yes.
Yep. First of all, thank you to the Folk och Försvar for arranging this, a very important issue to discuss. I would also like to take the opportunity to express our appreciation of the U.S. leadership for the coalition, not least Elisa, that we heard, is a very dedicated leader for the pole mill efforts we do together, and been crucial to keep this coalition together and made it stronger, I believe. Petra will speak about the broader Swedish engagement in Iraq and Syria, which is long-term and an effort that will go on for years. I will limit myself to the military part, and we do believe, the Swedish government believe, that a military military means are needed in this fight against Daesh. And at the end of the day, Daesh must be defeated also militarily. The Swedish troops in northern Iraq were deployed in August 2015 with a mission to train the Peshmerga. Under the umbrella of advise and assist, training has been focused on medical training, rule of law, close quarter battle, and counter improvised explosive devices. And as announced in July, the Swedish government has the intention to increase the military contribution in the fight against Daesh. And the intention, again, pending final political decisions, is to have this additional troops in place early 2017. And as a part of preparing a new bill to Parliament, and we see that it will be a bill that will cover 2017 a year. We also investigate the possibilities to reduce our national caveats for the Swedish troops. So I think I'll stop there. Happy to come back during Q&As.
Thank you, Johan. Go ahead, Petra.
Thank you. I'm loud and clear. Let me begin with also thanking Elisa Slotkin for her presentation, the US government, and also Folkenförsvar for giving me the opportunity to make a few points on the Swedish broader engagement in the fight against Daesh. Our support, as Johan was saying, our support to the coalition is both broad and long-term, and we welcome the military progress that has been made in both Iraq and in Syria. But while we should never underestimate the enormous challenges ahead, it's also fair to say that we've made some important headway in our joint efforts. But there are two aspects that we need to be well aware of, which are interconnected and that we believe are of particular importance if the coalition military efforts should not be reversed, in order for them not to be reversed. First, it's important for us to have a broad stabilization perspective, a plan that includes not only physical reconstruction, but also efforts that bear on reconciliation. That would be transitional justice, security sector reform, rule of law. And we've been pushing quite hard, the Swedish government has, within the EU to have more engagement from a body which is able to do all of that, which has as its core functions to do such things in order to support Iraq on the various issues. Because if they're left unaddressed, we're sure that they will become the primary drivers of new and recurring conflicts, which has also happened in the past. So while recognizing the obvious need to go forward at a high pace and with the huge security and immediate stabilization challenges, it's also important not to lose track of the need to link and sequence immediate stabilization with a post-liberation strategy, a strategy that is capable of dealing with the multiple security, political and economic challenges that lie ahead of us. A more long-term perspective is crucial to make the current stabilization efforts sustainable, to put it in one sentence. Secondly, our stabilization efforts must also be based on intensified efforts on the political side, both in Iraq and Syria, and of course military progress will also be dependent on this. Our efforts can never stabilize the region unless there is an underlying political solution to the problems in Iraq and Syria. And in this context, we support and promote the interest and the full participation of women, which we think has been not not addressed at the point it should be until now, because it's going to be crucial for a sustainable solution. In Iraq, responsibility for a political solution, of course, lies with the Iraqi government itself. But of course, the UN is also of crucial importance, and other international efforts and coordination. But if we can't complement these achievements with stabilization and political efforts, it will have consequences for the stability of the whole region, as well as probably creating new migration flows. And in this context, I'd just like to remind you that Sweden alone has received more than 20,000 Iraqi asylum seekers since 2011, and that's how many we have received so far. While for Syrians, the number is 120,000 since 2011. For my government, our long-standing commitment and support to Iraq has been primarily focused on humanitarian aid and a bilateral development cooperation program with a broader perspective. In terms of the humanitarian support, we remain one of the largest donors globally. In the period from 2014 to 2015, we allocated around 270 million Swedish kroner to the humanitarian response in Iraq. And so far this year, we've already provided more than 140 million Swedish kroner. And these funds are channeled mainly through the UN, but also through NGOs, and are dispersed based on the needs of the affected population in Iraq. But let me give you some examples also of the kind of local level stabilization efforts that we're trying to carry out. We've contributed 35 million Swedish kroner to a UNDP fund that is a funding facility for immediate stabilization, and it enables internally displaced people to return to cities liberated from Daesh by financing, for example, rehabilitation work of primary healthcare centers, schools, water stations, and sewage treatment plants. So that's basically to fill the void that is there when Daesh and the fighting has left. And moreover, we've also decided to provide 40 million Swedish kroner in additional funding to two successful bilateral projects in the field of capacity building for central and local administration. The first project is an extension of something that we've already done through SIDA, and it's aimed at strengthening the Prime Minister's Coordination Office with line ministries and to contribute to coordinating the Iraqi government's own efforts at stabilization and reconstruction. The second project that we've decided to prolong is, it's an extension of the Swedish Association of Local Authorities and Regions, SKL for those of you who speak Swedish. They have an international capacity building project, which is expected to strengthen governance and management in the social care sector of local administration in the Al-Qadisiyah and Dohuk provinces. So to conclude, the Swedish government believes that in addition to military and in addition to the military efforts, a political solution as well as a long-term perspective on civilian stabilization and reconciliation will be crucial in order for the coalition's efforts not to be reversed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elisa, let me welcome you back to join us here for the Q&A. I know that we have a lot of questions to Elisa and also to our Swedish friends from the government office. So please raise your hand. Yes. Can you wait for the microphone, please?
Maybe I shouldn't. People. Okay. Here we go. Hi, Alyssa. Nice to
Hi.
see you again.
See you.
So my name is Adriana Lindstad Albuquerque. I'm the project manager at the Swedish Defense Research Agency for the project there that works on the Middle East, and among other things, been following the campaign. So great to see you again. Anyway, I wanted to ask you specifically, you mentioned the importance of the stabilization process. And it seems to me that a lot this process is already unfolding in a way, right? As more and more territory of Daesh is re-liberated or liberated, so to speak. And I was wondering if you could speak briefly about some of the challenges of finding or given the scarcity of groups to work with, especially in Syria on a local level, what are some of the challenges in holding this territory and making sure that you have a somewhat smooth transition, hopefully, given the local population and their a relationship with these so-called MARC troops that are to hold the troops after Daesh? Thank you.
That's a great
territory.
question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So yes, it definitely is easier in Iraq than it is in Syria. Just quickly on Iraq, I think one of the hallmarks of this campaign is we've tried to be more flexible and agile than we were the last time we were in Iraq, right? So instead of having a strategy for many, many years and holding very clear talking points and a clear end state, we still have an end state. The way we go about prosecuting the campaign is adaptable based on the needs on the ground. So the perfect example is what we learned from Tikrit and Ramadi, right? Both places that were liberated by Iraqi troops who needed a significant stabilization effort upon completion. And to be honest with you, there were a lot of lessons learned through that process. All of this is Iraqi-led, so it's not us doing it. But I think the obvious thing is people need to feel safe when knowing that they can come back to their homes, and you need a strong, trusted presence on the ground in order to give people that faith. So the importance of the police became critical to us. And that's something your colleagues probably noticed from us is, I would say about a year ago, we started talking about the need for contributions on police training because we realized that we had started to retrain some of the Iraqi military, but it shouldn't be the military that provides for security in these towns afterwards. So we learned a number of lessons, some of them hard fought, hard learned, to the point where when we got to Ramadi, there was much more organization and planning that went into that when the military went in to take Ramadi. So in Iraq, I think we have our system relatively in a good spot. In Syria, it's much more complicated because you don't have a local government structure or a national government structure that has writ over the entire state or any one town that we're liberating. So what has been important for us is to ensure that there are local communities, preferably local councils, that are formed almost immediately upon ISIL being kicked out, that have responsibility for being the interface with the coalition, with the Syrian Democratic Forces, and particularly with NGO groups. So while access, I think, is still a problem for many NGO groups in Syria, in the liberated area, particularly in northeastern Syria, we have been able to have NGO groups come in, interface with these local councils, figure out what they need, figure out how we can get sort of the mechanics of a town or city working again in the hope that people return. Much harder in Syria. I don't want to make it sound like it's just seamless. It's not. But that's the theory of the case. And the thing that we will always maintain is that we don't believe any outside group should have governance control over any area that's liberated. That's a fundamental principle in an area where we know there's tensions between Arabs and Kurds, and there's a lot going on in northern Syria. So the principle of local control over local communities is our guiding principle.
Thank you. Petra, you like to comment on that?
No, not really.
Sure. So let's move on. Johanne.
My name is Johanne Hildebrandt. I'm an author and fellow of Royal War Academy as well. I have two questions, of course. It's very disturbing reports from Iraq. In Baghdad, the criminals are taking over streets and strengthening their positions. The Kurds are getting stronger in the north. What will happen? Will Iraq hold as a nation? And another question for for military question is, will Sweden, I think you heard something about changing the Kuwait, will Sweden send troops into Syria and fight with the Danes, for example? Is that a possibility?
So I'll go first on the first question. So our policy is still and unambiguously for a unified Iraq. That's what we're working for. When we provide assistance, military assistance or otherwise, it goes through the central government. And that's to demonstrate our commitment to that state staying whole and unified. So that's still our policy, but I don't think it's any secret that the Iraqis have some longstanding political problems that will ultimately need to be resolved for this state to actually be able to develop into all it can be. And as the threat of Daesh becomes a little less imminent, some of those old political debates are absolutely coming to the fore. So our policy is to urge, particularly through our diplomats, that the Iraqis work out, and we help them work out some of these long-standing differences. Because if not, then the area will always be a fertile ground for Daesh to exploit. So that is our major effort right now. Our State Department does a huge amount of work on this very issue. Mosul is obviously the sort of focus of attention because it is second biggest city in Iraq, ISIL's headquarters in Iraq, and it is an important place in Iraqi history. So we are trying to use Mosul as a way to get the Iraqis to agree on a plan. And hope that that trust building and that confidence building helps us deal with some of those existential questions of the state. But just as in 15 years ago, every party in Iraq, every group, Shia, Sunni, Kurd, has an incentive to stay in the state. They are better off as part of a unified state for 100 reasons, military, financial, you name it, than apart. And we hope that that, combined with a strong push from the international community to maintain a unified state, will help them get through some of these fundamental problems and be all that they can be in that region.
Thank you. Johan?
Yes, regarding the caveats, we will, of course, listen carefully to the demands from the military part of the branch of the coalition, what are requested. We will consult our armed forces and see what their analysis will tell us. And if that, as it is now, we're limited to northern Iraq. If there is a demand, we will have to consider that. At the end, it's a political issue, of course, if we are to operate elsewhere. So it remains to be seen, but I think such questions will certainly be on the table in the process.
So do we have a question like that now? Like, is there any demand for Sweden to extend the military? No? Yes.
I don't know if you're looking at me or you're looking at her. It's for you.
Petra, would you like to comment on that? No? No? Okay. So go ahead, sir, in the back.
Thank you. My name is Pierre Schori. I'm a former member of Swedish government, but above all a concerned citizen. Now I just heard that the caveats might be changed, and I can only see this as an open invitation to you, Elisa. Thank you for that. It will be discussed, certainly, publicly, too. I am very concerned that Sweden is engaged in this because I don't know enough. So I went to the Global Coalition's website, #CoalitionProgress. And it is not very enlightening. I have two questions at the end. Because it says, under the hashtag, news as it happens. And then it says, we are delivering new live feed for the latest updates and breaking news. The latest update is for 3 days ago, when the coalition strike kills an ISIL leader. But there is no mentioning whatsoever of the attack on the Syrian troops, which is now threatening the whole process. And neither of you mentioned it, you the military representatives here. I think this is very strange that you didn't mention it, but you don't present the problems.
Is that question?
That's what was first question. So how did you prepare the intelligence on that attack for the Elisa? And how was the Swedish government informed, who is now going to be a host nation and as a a member of this coalition. How did you, and are you going to express regrets at this meeting? Will you do it here? Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Sure. So, as I mentioned in my talk, I anticipated that there'd be plenty of questions about Russia vis-a-vis Syria, the United States. So I think my government has been very clear about this since the incident happened. Obviously, we're still figuring out the details, but if we made prosecuted the strike mistakenly, we will certainly express regret. And we did that in our public statement on Saturday. We said, I'm sorry, I can send you it on your email if you'd like, but if this was an inadvertent strike, we will certainly express regret. That said, I happen to co-chair the safety channel that we keep with the Russians. We've had it now for a year. It's worked largely very well, and it's a way for me to communicate directly with the Russians in addition to the operators communicating on issues of flight safety. So I just want to be clear that we communicated the location of our strike 30 minutes ahead of the strike to the Russians via our traditional channel. And then I think the Russians, as we struck, the Russians realized that it was a Syrian target. They called us immediately through the established channel, and they told us to wave off, and we immediately waved off. Let me contrast that to the attack that they prosecuted back in June against the town of El Tanf, where unexpectedly they struck at an area we have never seen them strike before, and they hit a number of our Syrian aligned forces that were engaged in a fight against ISIL. We called them via the established channel and asked them to wave off. They ignored us. We put planes up to help for medevac of the forces that were being killed on the ground. They did not wave off. They came to prosecute a second strike hours later. We told them to wave off. They did not. Finally, when we saw a third wave of strikes coming on a town that was fighting, a group that was fighting ISIL, they finally turned around hours and hours later. So the idea that the Russians are somehow on the moral high ground here, I reject. That said, if we are the United States, if we do something wrong, we will admit it. And I stand by that. But I just don't want there to be any confusion that despite the rhetoric coming out of the Russians right now, I ask you to ask them whether they admit their mistakes for the El Tanf attack. I will readily do it just as my department did on Saturday. And but let me be clear, you are absolutely right that this elevated tone of rhetoric has not helped the situation on maintaining the cessation of hostilities, and that is what we want. We're all in this because the spectrum of human suffering in Syria is significant, some of the most significant I've ever seen, and I worked wars for years and years. So we want this to work. We negotiated, I personally were involved in the negotiations to get this deal. The Russians have to live up to their end of the deal. They are distracting us by talking about the strike. Humanitarian assistance is still not getting into Aleppo. That is a requirement of the deal. So I think the Russians are very good at using the media to talk about their moral high ground, and I just ask everyone here to put it in perspective.
Please, sir, respect the fact that you need to wait for the microphone. Thank you for a very clear answer, Lisa. I guess that the other part of the question was directed to our Swedish friends.
Just as I'm sure you know that we are not active in Syria, so and it's up to coalition partners active in Syria to comment on what's happening there. I would subscribe very much to the picture Elisa gave us on how different actors play the role in Syria. When it comes to what we discuss with the US and other coalition partners, we have the coalition meetings, and we have a political military consultation tomorrow, and I'm sure that this issue will be addressed. It will be discussed among partners in the coalition.
Thank you. Do you want to add to that, Petra? No? Okay, sir, we have one more question here. Go ahead.
I'm Bertil Malmberg. I'm a fellow of the Royal Academy for Naval Sciences. And my question is the following. You stressed a lot the need for stabilization. But how does a coalition cope with or handle the fact that ISIS, Daesh, whatever you call it, has a significant support in all of the region on the ideological level?
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll take a stab and then happy to hand it over to my colleagues. So what we have found when we have helped the Iraqis liberate towns and cities in Iraq is that there may be a core of people who do support ideologically what ISIL is trying to do. They tend to run, and the people who are left are the people who, just like under Saddam before them, they felt the need to sign up to the campaign to save their own lives, because that was literally a form of self-preservation. So while I don't dismiss the idea that the ideology out there is popular, I think that most people under ISIL's rule have been completely subjugated by the fact that they're at the barrel of a gun. And I don't ascribe guilt to all of those people by any means. Now, the ideology that that ISIL perpetuates, despite the fact that it is barbaric, I mean, it's truly amazing what they do, a degree worse than I've ever seen. They do hold a certain appeal. They have used the internet masterfully, and that's something we're actively trying to work on. So I don't dismiss that they are using ideology in a really critical way, but I also believe that the vast majority of people who live under ISIL don't do it willfully. They are happy when they are liberated, and they look forward to just having their life go back to normal, services, some sort of structure, ability to go to the market and buy food for their families, rather than a hope and a dream of some sort of ideology.
Thank you. Petra, do you want to add to that? Can we say something about the Swedish view about what's going on more deeply in the region and the ideological part?
Well, I agree with what Elisa was just saying, and I don't really see that there's a dichotomy between our stabilization efforts and trying to sort of win back the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people, rather the other way around. I think what we need to do is be working on the root causes, and what we're trying to do with our bilateral cooperation aid and the long-term stabilization is to make sure that there is a life to return to, that there is communal services, that there is sort of a work and life going on in Iraqi societies that will sort of make the point for itself that life can actually return to normal once Daesh has left, and that will be the proof, I think.
Thank you. I know we have a lot of questions. Please raise your hand. Elisa, I'm a bit curious about, we tend to talk about what happens after Raqqa and Mosul falls. I want to know, do we have any idea about where they will go after that happens?
Yeah, it's something that we're actively looking at and planning for now. I think common wisdom was that, as I said, that they would look to ungoverned and undergoverned places as somewhere they might have freedom of action to organize, to recruit, to train, to raise money. And particularly, I think Libya was the most attractive place. I think at this point, we know there's chatter in the community about whether that's still a viable place to go. And therefore, we're thinking through the second and third, fourth scenarios on what they might do. And I think there are places that are offer some of those undergoverned spaces in the Middle East. Still in North Africa, there's places that may be appetizing to them. But I think, if ISIL has Raqqa and Mosul removed from their resume, and they've had that very public failure, I think our intelligence community in the United States has been vocal about the fact that ISIL may feel like they need to demonstrate they're still relevant by perpetrating attacks, particularly where they're from. And so this is the reason our cooperation is so robust with countries like Sweden, with other European countries that might have some citizens who are fighting in these places. Because if that's the mandate, then that has significant consequences for all of us here. So we are doing work on it. No one has a crystal ball, but we think that the sheer fact that they might lose Mosul and Raqqa is the concept that might be within reach is creating pressure within their community. Our targeting of their financial assets is having an effect on their ability to pay their people. These are all signs of a organization under stress. And I think what we're concerned about is that an organization under stress could feel the need to demonstrate its relevancy again with high-profile attacks.
Thank you. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Anders Örstum. I'm a development worker. And I heard from the Red Cross that they haven't had any, it's the first terror groups forever that they never were able to have any dialogue with for 160 years. It must be something like that. So I wonder, do you have any dialogue with Daesh, or do you have any plans how to get a dialogue with them, or do you consider it as a hopeless case? And can you win a war on a group that you can't have a dialogue with? Thank you.
So we had this issue also with Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda core, that there just is not, certainly we have no interest in communicating with them. I don't think they have any interest in communicating with us. And we believe it's beyond the power of negotiation, that some of the unilateral and just barbaric things that they're doing are so fundamentally non-negotiable to us and those with a liberal and Western approach to the world, that we just can't find common ground. So we are not in touch with ISIL. We do not seek to be in touch with ISIL. We seek to put them under systematic pressure militarily through pulling people away from them, through making them less attractive. I think that there are a number of actors in Syria that we can deal with and we do deal with. But there are some groups that are just, it's beyond the pale of negotiation. And just like Al-Qaeda core beforehand, that's how we treat ISIL.
Thank you. Yes, one more question. Go ahead.
Yes, just a follow-up question on...
Your name, sir, please.
Yep. My name is Dennis Hultgren. I'm from the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, MSB. And on your last question there were on the tentative fall of Mosul and Raqqa. First of all, do we know anything about how radicalized the people of especially Raqqa are? Will they see it, view this as a liberation or a possible occupation? That's my first question. The second is on vetting of the refugees, because there will be refugees when Mosul falls and Raqqa as well. Will there be any vetting process done locally, or in the second and third scenarios you mentioned, if they move to Europe? Or will we wait to do the vetting once they're here, or will we do it in the theater?
Thank you.
Sure. So in terms of whether people in Mosul will see us as occupiers or liberators, I think we have obviously Iraqis who are in touch with friends, family, associates who are inside of Mosul, and our information is the vast majority of people there just had the terrible consequence of geography. They were there when ISIL took over, and they were average citizens unable to defend themselves, and they came under new rule. Like I said, obviously there are people there who are hardcore supporters of the ideology, but we do not believe that's the majority. Now, if you were from Mosul and you had lived under ISIL for 2 years, you would take, I'm guessing, a bit of a wait-and-see approach once military action came to Mosul. So that just highlights the critical importance of stabilization in the early days after the military campaign, so that people who are wondering, will this last, will ISIL come back, are these new Iraqi security forces the ones that I should invest my trust in? A lot of that, I think, will have to do with how fast stabilization comes and governance and some sort of structure comes to Mosul. So that's what we're working hard to get ahead of. Obviously, we know there will be internally displaced people. There is already quite a bit of work going on with the UN on preparing additional space in camps for internally displaced people. So your question about refugees, I can't speak to whether those internally displaced people will then depart Iraq. What we have found on the Iraqis is that the majority of Iraqis who run from their towns and cities stay within Iraq. They aren't represented in the numbers that you might see Syrians or other economic migrants coming into Europe. That said, I can't predict the future, but I think the fact that people went home to Tikrit, people went home to Ramadi, People are going home to Haditha. People are going home to Heat. These cities are not emptied out the way you unfortunately see some places in Syria. So I think Iraqis want to come home, and the challenge for the Iraqi government and for the coalition supporting it is to make it appealing and viable for people to stay or come back to their homes.
Thank you. I know we have a lot of more questions, but before, I'm a bit curious about tomorrow's meeting. Can we say something about what's on the agenda? What is your expectations for Sweden, and also from my Swedish friends, if you can say what is important and core questions for Sweden tomorrow?
So, these are very standard political military consultations. We have them every 3 or 4 months. They're a way to make sure that in addition to our military colleagues all living and working together, that the policy level is having conversations. Obviously, we had a full defense ministerial and full foreign ministerial for the counter-ISIL campaign in July in Washington. So much of our agenda will be following up from the tasks that our ministers gave us, the good amount of work that they tasked us with, and then preparing for another ministerial likely in the winter sometime. So I don't want to go into the specifics since that's our business, but it's certainly following up on all the things we were tasked to do. And frankly, most of that falls under the theme of thinking ahead. Let's not just think about the next 2 weeks or a month, but what does the scenario look like post-Mosul, post-Raqqa? Where does it go? What should we be planning for now as Ministry of Defense officials?
That's interesting. Johan or Petra, you want to add something?
Well, I can only underline the issue of looking forward and what we have talked about today. How does this military component fit with other means within the coalition? Stabilization, long-term commitment, long-term engagement. And I expect all of us to have a better view on different considerations in capitals, not only within our Ministries of Defense responsibilities. I will be accompanied by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, for example, tomorrow. So I think this is very important to have this comprehensive, holistic approach, and so that we can also keep our political masters in the loop. What's happening in the efforts.
Thank you, Petra. No,
I completely agree.
Yeah, that's good. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Lennart Wohlgemuth from Gothenburg University. You haven't mentioned any of the other engaged parties like Iran, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Perhaps that is outside today's discussion, but particularly the very recent changes in Turkey is of quite interest. It's a sort of schizophrenic ambitions from Turkey to participate against Daesh, but also with friends to Daesh. How are you going to deal with that?
Sure. So, as I said, I consider Syria to be the most complex foreign policy issue that I work on, certainly.
Oh,
pardon. Is that me?
Can we have a hand microphone? Yeah.
Sure. You're a little taller than me, so let me. So it's just exceedingly complex, Syria. And it's complex because of the civil war. It's complex because the civil war allowed ISIL to create a huge foothold. It's complex because neighbors are exceedingly concerned about the spread of extremism because of the refugee flows coming out of that country, because of Russia's engagement, because of Iranians' interests. I mean, it is a kind of a case study of complexity. What I would say about Turkey is we have been working for some time now with the Turks because they are on the front lines, particularly when it comes to extremists and ISIL along their border. We have been working with them internally on shoring up their borders, on shoring up the information exchange so that any foreign fighters going and transiting their country, they have information on and can take action on. And we've seen some real improvements. The border region where Turkey is now engaged, those the final 98 kilometers of territory that ISIL controlled along their border. We have been talking with the Turks about that area for quite some time because we're both concerned about it. It was the last free and open outlet from Syria out to Turkey and Europe. So when the Turks took action, again, after being attacked and attacked and attacked in their cities, we supported that action. Against ISIL. And we are now engaged with them in the movement from the border town of Jarablus through the border town of Rawai. It's that final 98 kilometers. We are in support, and the coalition is providing direct support to those operations. Now, it is no secret that the Turks have deep concerns about some of the Kurdish actors that are active in Syria. And you, I'm sure, saw reports of Turkey taking action against some of those actors. The United States strongly urged both sides to de-escalate, move apart from each other, and allow us to engage in confidence building between both sides so that we didn't have Kurdish groups who are fighting ISIL and Turks who are fighting ISIL fighting each other. That's still our strong policy desire, is that they not engage each other. And we are talking to the Turks every single day about that. But in the meantime, we are very actively supporting their counter-ISIL activities through air support, special operations support, everything you can think of. And a huge part of the campaign against ISIL is based out of Incirlik. So they are providing critical basing access for us and the coalition. So it's complex, and we work at it every single day. But to us, the importance of getting rid of ISIL in that last border area has just been fundamental.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, hold on, sir. Wait for the microphone.
My name is Bertil Malmberg again. I have some friends in Sweden with relatives in Syria. And we discussed the situation already just after the so-called Arabic Spring. And they said they were living quite well in Syria, despite there was a dictatorship. Now, when this Arabic Spring occurred all over the region, most people in the West mistakenly thought that all these regimes should more or less automatically be released by westernized democratic regimes. In all places, it didn't happen. In no one of the places. Egypt, Syria, Libya.
Do you have
because they had
sir?
taken away one thing in the, from the equation, and that radical Islam. Didn't they were a bit naive?
Was that a question in there, sir? Yeah, okay. Yes, directed to Elissa, or?
I'm going to assume it's to me.
Yeah.
I think, well, I guess I find it interesting. If I reverse your question, then it's a support of autocracy and dictatorship. I'm not sure what when people of the region decided after years and years and years that they wanted to rise up democratically. They used social media in a way we had never seen, and they organized themselves. You know, we receive a lot of criticism for coming out in public support for that. But what was the alternative? To come out in support of non-democratically elected leaders? I don't understand the suggestion in your comment other than to say we did not start the Arab Spring. What we did was support democratic movements by people to have a voice in their own government. No one would say they're happy with the state of the region. No one would say that. But what I'm having a hard time accepting is the causality that somehow US coming in on the side of people who are democratically protesting is at fault for extremism, or that there was an alternative, that somehow we should have been pro-Assad, pro-autocratic, because of the extremism that could have been released by that. I just think it's an untenable position for a principled democracy, and that's why the question confuses me.
You want to add to that, Petra, maybe?
Well, I can certainly agree. We'll continue to stand up for democracy and fight for the right to rule with a popular vote and parliamentary elections and whatnot. So definitely along the same lines.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Can I add something?
Yeah, sure, of course.
I also on this part of whether people are have a ideological preference for Daesh or not. Of course, there's only a part of the Syrian tragedy, and we all have a responsibility to do our utmost to stop the killing, etc., in Syria. But at least it's my personal belief that the ideological support and attraction with Daesh is very limited to a small number of people, and I believe that there might be fear for Daesh in the liberated areas, but I don't see that we have no such evidence for a broad popular support. So I think we should be very clear on that point, and I think the same goes for people that live abroad that are that have to face this ideology. If it's, I don't sure if it's worth to be called such, but anyhow.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and I guess we could wrap this up a little bit early in order to let Elisa go to her busy schedule. Any more questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Sofia from the news agency TT. I'm just wondering how many civilians that have been killed in the coalition airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. I think last week Pentagon admitted some civilians might have been killed in Raqqa, and then you had the reports outside Manbij in July, I think. And also I wonder how you look upon the cost of civilian lives contra the effect of the airstrikes.
Thank you.
Sure. So I would say there is no military power in the history of the world that has cared more about civilian casualties than the current coalition. And we acknowledge fully that civilians, of course, have been killed by us and certainly in large numbers by other actors. But what I would say is the rigorousness of our targeting process, which accepts a civilian casualty rate as 0 as its baseline, is the most rigorous process that certainly anyone in the US military has ever seen, and probably, as I said, the history of any military. It goes through a constant process of vetting and evaluation, and civilian casualties, the determination about civilian casualties is at the heart of our targeting process. There are many targets right now that we cannot prosecute because of the risk to civilian life. And that is a choice we make every single day. And our military commanders are the ones supporting keeping to that strict policy, because they know that if you kill significant numbers of civilians, you lose the population, you lose the moral authority to come in and help liberate people. I don't have a total number for you. I apologize. We can certainly get that number to you. We are transparent about this thing. That's part of us being a principled military. I would say whatever that number is, it pales in comparison to what ISIL does to people in the territory they control, to what the Assad regime perpetuates every day on the ground, to what ISIL does in Iraq. So while we will, of course, acknowledge civilian casualties when they happen, and that is our responsibility, I just don't want to I want to make sure there's no equivalency to what ISIL and others will do on the ground. But we're open about it. I just don't have it off the top of my head. I apologize.
Thank you very much. Before we wrap up, any words for the future? What are your hopes for the future, Elisa?
Well, I certainly hope that in a short period of time that this parent tumor, the Iraq-Syria question on ISIL, they no longer have the base of operations from which to project power. And I hope that we will do, together with our partners and allies, the rigorous planning that we need to do to protect us from sort of the next round of concerns. And I hope very much to have Swedish support and other support from the rest of our coalition as this fight continues to evolve. So thanks
Thank
very much.
you. Johan, Petra, you want to add something to that? Any ending words? No? Thank you, Elisa, for taking time in your busy schedule. Thank you, Petra and Johan. A warm applause.